The first rule of the podcast is you should talk about the podcast. The second rule of the podcast is you should talk about the podcast. That's right. Tell everyone you know to subscribe. Maybe the girl you have a crush on, your imaginary friend, or your weird terrorist cult buddies. And then strap in because we are talking about 1999's Fight Club on this episode of Blind Spots and Second Thoughts. Welcome to Blind Spots and Second Thoughts. I'm Dan.
I'm Heather.
And I am very, very excited for the movie we're covering in this episode. Heather, what do you know, or what do you think you know, about the movie Fight Club?
I think I know a few things about this one. I know that the first rule of Fight Club is that you don't talk about Fight Club, so
okay,
maybe I shouldn't say anything.
What's the second rule of Fight Club?
That I don't know.
Okay.
I only know the first rule. I should probably say right off the bat that I do believe I know the twist of this movie.
Which is?
That Brad Pitt is Edward Norton.
Okay, so like in what way? What do you mean?
He's an alter ego.
Okay.
That's my understanding.
Why do you think you know that?
I just feel like I've picked that up from pop culture osmosis.
Nothing specific.
No, I can't think of what has given me that impression. I mean, I've heard a lot about Fight Club over the years, and I feel like I've just seen jokes or things in other media that have led me to believe that that's the twist of the movie, but right now, I can't think of any specific examples of what that might have been. I feel like this is referenced in a lot of other things.
That's potentially true. Okay, so aside from Brad Pitt and Ed Norton, can you name anyone else in the cast of this movie?
I cannot.
So other notable names in the cast include Jared Leto.
Oh.
Helena Bonham Carter.
Oh.
And Meatloaf.
Wow. Okay. What a combination of people. What a set that must have been.
You've said a few things that you think you know. What do you think this movie is about, or what do you think happens in this movie?
Well, not to sound glib, but I think there is a fight club. I think there is an actual club where people beat each other up and, you know, or fight to win like a boxing type match.
Okay.
But unofficially, based on what I believe I know about Brad Pitt being Edward Norton's alter ego, I feel that maybe Edward Norton is kind of more of a mild-mannered person, and he becomes more violent, more aggressive, maybe better at fighting, and attributes that to Brad Pitt's character, who I also believe he thinks is another person. Like, he doesn't realize that that's his alter ego. I think he sees him as a separate person.
So not like kind of an Incredible Hulk type sort of thing, or? I
can't say because I don't really know the reference.
Okay. And you don't know anything else about the movie, or any guesses about anything else in the movie?
No.
Okay, well, you might be right about some things and you might be very wrong about some other things. So
I'm sure
I guess
I am.
We'll see. So, Fight Club is based on a book of the same name by author Chuck Palahniuk, published in 1996. The movie was released in October of 1999. Other notable movies released that fall were American Beauty, Three Kings, Boys Don't Cry, Being John Malkovich, and Toy Story 2. That was 1999 was a fantastic year for movies, and that was just fall. The Matrix also came out that year too.
We were on the cusp of the millennium, and people were just going crazy with entertainment. I don't know what I'm saying. I started that sentence because I knew that 1999 was the cusp of the millennium, but I didn't know where it was going.
So I'm just curious, out of those other movies that I named, which ones have you seen? American Beauty?
No.
Three Kings?
No.
Boys Don't Cry?
No.
Being John Malkovich?
No.
Oh, that's going on the list. So Toy Story 2
Yeah,
is the
that's
one
the
that
only
you've
one.
seen.
I've seen The Matrix.
Have you seen all of the Matrixes?
I don't think so. I think
Matrices? Is it,
Yeah, that's
is it
the
plural?
plural,
The Matrix
yeah.
movie, plural is matrices.
I think I've only seen the first one. If I've seen the others, I don't remember them at all or remember watching them.
All right. This movie is from David Fincher, who at this point had directed Alien 3, 7, or as it's known on IMDb, Sesevenin, and The Game.
Okay. I have seen both 7 and The Game. The Game with Michael Douglas, right? Mm-hmm. Okay.
One of those movies I just named, I refuse to watch. One of those movies I really like, and one of those movies I have watched and refuse to ever watch again. Guess which is which?
I think 7 is the one you've watched and refused to watch again. I think you've told me that. What was the first? Alien 3. Is that the one you refused to watch? And so then The Game.
Yeah, I really like The
watched
Game.
a lot?
Yeah. That's a really good one.
I've only seen it once. I watched it in college for a class, actually.
Really? Mm-hmm. One of my favorite quotes from director David Fincher is that he likes to make movies that scar, which now in hindsight, looking back, lends itself to jokes about how boring Mank was. Mank was a movie that David Fincher directed.
Don't get that joke.
This movie, Fight Club, was actually a bomb when it came out. It was shuffled around on the release schedule from summer to that very crowded fall, partially because of Columbine, because Columbine had just happened that spring of 1999. For me personally, this is a movie that I came to pretty late, so I actually didn't catch it until a little while later. I believe I first saw it on home video, and I was blown away. So we'll see why in just a little bit. Can you think of any quotes other than the one you said, or notable scenes that you know of, or anything that stands out?
No, really the only thing that I can think of is about the first rule of Fight Club that I think has been parodied to excess.
What do you think that means in the context of the movie?
I think it's probably a secret fight club.
Okay.
That it's exclusive.
Pretty much right there in the rule.
And that could just be context clues, or it could be, again, maybe picking up on actual details of the movie over the years. But yes, my guess would be that there is an actual fight club that exists and it's secret. And so if you've been invited to join the fight club, you may not speak of it to any outsiders, or you will be kicked out of the club.
Literally or metaphorically?
Possibly both.
All right. Well, I think you are going to be surprised with this movie. I'm excited. So let's watch it.
If you are seated in an emergency exit row, and feel you would be unable or unwilling to perform the duties listed on the safety card, please ask a flight attendant to reseat you.
It's a lot of responsibility.
Want to switch seats?
No, I'm not sure I'm the man for that particular job.
An exit door procedure at 30,000 feet. The illusion of safety.
Yeah, I guess so.
You know why they put oxygen masks on planes?
So you can breathe.
Oxygen gets you high. In a catastrophic emergency, you're taking giant panic breaths. Suddenly you become euphoric, docile. You accept your fate. It's all right here. Emergency water landing 600 miles an hour. Blank faces, calm as Hindu cows.
That's an interesting theory. What do you do?
What do you mean?
What do you do for a living?
Why? So you can pretend like you're interested.
Okay.
You have a kind of sick desperation in your laugh?
We have the exact same briefcase.
Soap.
Sorry?
I make and I sell soap. The yardstick of civilization.
And this is how I met Tyler Durden.
Did you know if you mixed equal parts of gasoline and frozen orange juice concentrate, you can make napalm?
No, I did not know that. Is that true?
That's right. One can make all kinds of explosives using simple household items.
Really?
If one were so inclined.
Tyler, you are by far the most interesting single-serving friend I've ever met. See, I have this thing, everything on a plane is single-serving, even the...
Well, I get it. It's very clever.
Oh, thank you.
How's it working out for you?
What?
Being clever.
Okay, Heather. So, Fight Club. We're going to break the first rule and the second rule of Fight Club, and we're going to talk about what we just saw. So,
it's apparently very important to not talk about Fight Club. I did not know that was the second rule as well. Whew. Yeah, let's talk about it.
All right. So, first of all, before we talk about what you thought about it, that was not what you were expecting, was it?
No, not entirely. I mean, I do think that the things that I knew about it turned out to be correct. They didn't vary too much from what I had imagined, but there was a lot more to it than what I suspected. Yeah, just a lot more anti-consumerism that I was not necessarily expecting. And it was just very thematic in a way that, you know, I just really knew that they were going to fight. But as far as the sort of larger messages of the movie, I didn't really know what those were going to be.
Well, and, you know, did you know about the fourth wall breaking and twisted narrative and the pipeline from insomnia to support group tourism to
I
terrorism?
Definitely didn't expect that he was going to start crashing all kinds of support groups. I didn't know anything about that.
Or start a large terrorist organization across multiple cities in America.
Although that does track from a Fight Club. I mean, that's not a huge leap.
Well, I mean, this movie really did nail, especially when you look and you think that this was made in 1999, that sort of incel to terrorist pipeline.
Yes.
And it was really ahead of that, I think. And one of the reasons that this movie has aged so well is because it really captures that and it really stays relevant today, especially when you look at it in the wake of everything that's happened in the last 5-6 years.
Absolutely. I didn't really see the broader picture at first. And I feel like it takes a while for the movie to get to the actual Fight Club. And then once that forms and we're seeing the people who are joining and what's going on with the actual organization, this is a movie about fragile masculinity.
It is. It absolutely is. And especially it's very much framed in a Gen X fragile masculinity. Like it really is about the way that Gen X men were feeling very lost. A lot of it also ties into the state the country was in the 1990s. So it doesn't necessarily resonate in the same way that I think it would for Gen X men, but there are a lot of things that are still applicable and still very, very relevant today when you look at 4chan culture. Like Tyler Durden would definitely be a shit poster on 4chan.
Absolutely. That was a question that I had for you was, you're a man. And so I guess I would be curious to know what you thought and how you felt about the people who joined the Fight Club. What was your impression of those people, or what do you think was the aim of the movie in presenting these fellows?
That's a good question. That's interesting. We haven't even gotten to what you thought about the movie yet, so we'll get back to that. But
okay.
So to answer your question, yeah, I think the movie is like they're very clearly lost men. Like they are directionless. They don't have, a lot of them are what we would call essential workers now. That's a phrase that came out of the 2020 pandemic, and that's something that we didn't really talk about before. But they are essential workers. They are working class. They are stuck and that same thing that we're seeing now. And this was before the recession and the pandemic and everything else that's happened in the last 20 years. So it's this idea of they were still stuck, but everything was great. So they still had that, we're not going to be movie stars or rock gods or millionaires. We are still pumping gas, but everything is fantastic. Why is that? I think when I was younger, I did feel a lot of that ennui. Like you feel like you're running on a treadmill in life as a young man, and you don't have solid male role models for a lot of different reasons, culturally, or because you were raised by a single mother. Like I was raised by a single mother. So if you have a charismatic figure who comes in and tells you this is what being a man is, it could be really easy to be susceptible to that. And some of what Tyler's philosophy is sounds good at first. Like it's very, because there's anti-consumerism, everybody knows capitalism is broken. So the first part of his philosophy is really tempting because he's got a point. But then it's like, okay, now we're going way too far into nihilism and terrorism. And that's when things start to fall apart. I've always said that most people who have, other than a very surface reading of Fight Club, they realize that Tyler Durden is not the good guy. Like Tyler Durden is not correct. And that's the whole point. Some people don't have good media literacy. So unfortunately, sometimes, especially in the early 2000s, Fight Club posters were all over college dorm walls. Fight Club posters were the new Pulp Fiction on dorm room walls. And a lot of people did miss the point. They got as far as the surface level and, it's right. Yeah, society sucks and all of that. But they missed the greater point as far as when you take nihilism too far, bad things happen.
Right. Well, that's the reason I was curious to know, is because obviously my lived experience has been different in that I have never had to grapple with society's expectations of what it means to be a man. And so watching this movie, I didn't know if it was because I'm a woman or if it's because I was watching a movie from 1999 in 2024, or if it's because I'm in my late mid-30s and I think that maybe this is about the experience of people who are younger than that. I'm not really sure. Maybe it was a combination of all three, but I looked at the men in the Fight Club and I'm like, these guys are pathetic. But I didn't know if that's how we were supposed to see them, or if that's just my own interpretation based on, those other factors.
See, why do you think they're pathetic?
Because that kind of violence, beating someone else up, does not make you a strong man.
My opinion is that's not the point. The point is to feel alive. And so it's not to project strength, and because it's about connection to a sort of a mythical primal thing. The same reason like why people will do stuff like the paleo diet and things like that. Like our ancestors had it correct. And, Tyler has his speech about when the narrator, who I'll refer to as Jack because that's what the screenplay refers to him as, when Jack is fading in and out after their car accident, Tyler has his speech about in his ideal world, it would just be overgrown and people would be climbing vines around skyscrapers. So it's that need to connect to a primal thing because consumerism made them feel listless and disconnected. Consumerism didn't make them feel listless and disconnected, but because everything was so great, because it was the 1990s, they didn't really have anything else to blame. Like now we can look at just everything and look around and say, oh, there's a recession. It was a lot harder to find something to blame. And so you could maybe more easily, instead of finding a scapegoat, you really did have to look at society. And then instead of like, well, maybe finding a constructive thing. Tyler's philosophy in the movie is self-improvement is masturbation, self-destruction is positive, self-destruction is good. I don't think the movie is siding with Tyler in that, but that kind of thing, it does feel good in the short term and it does give young men direction. So I would argue and say that the men themselves, they aren't pathetic, but it is sad that they were so directionless and all it took was for somebody who was charismatic punching himself in a parking lot to to essentially build a cult out of that, and then that snowballs into terrorism. But again, we see a lot of that today. It's very easy to see around a particular former president.
Who?
It could be anybody. I don't know. I don't think it's fair to say that the men are pathetic. I think it is sad and maybe a little bit tragic that you have so many directionless men and voiceless men. And when someone comes in who is charismatic, then they follow him so readily and so willingly.
Mm-hmm. Pathetic might have been a bit of a harsh choice of words, but you yourself said lost and sad. And that is definitely what I was seeing. But I would also make the argument that there is a lot of the actual Fight Club before it turns into a bigger mission where they're setting out to attack consumerism and materialism, Project Mayhem. And so to me, it just seems like, and I know that those themes were already there because we're seeing that through the eyes of Tyler, and the narrator, I guess, is what he's called. Edward Norton's character is called, even though he is Tyler. But anyway, we're seeing those themes through their eyes. But for these masses of men who join, it's just, to me, it reads as mostly just about the fighting. And there are themes about what does it mean to be a man. And so I don't know. It did make me sad. And maybe pathetic wasn't the right word to use for that. But I'm just like, this isn't the way. But again, I think that's probably just stemming from my own experiences and not really knowing what it was like to feel those messages of what masculinity is about. But also just culturally in 1999, I was too young to be susceptible to that same kind of messaging. I mean, I was obviously getting societal messaging, but I was a young teenage girl. So that doesn't resonate with me at all. And so I watch it and I'm like, but this is not what it means to be a man.
I mean, I think that's, again, I think if you look at the movie beyond a surface level reading, the movie is saying that too. And I think from what I understand in the book, I haven't read the whole book, but I've read the ending because I wanted to know how much it diverged from the book. The book and the movie do have pretty different endings.
I also read a little bit about the book.
So I wanted to know how the book ended differently. The book makes that a little bit more explicit, but I think, again, if you have any kind of media literacy at all, the movie makes it pretty clear that, like, this is a bad thing. This is this is not an idealized thing. There are still a lot of people who don't get that point. That's one of the dangers when you have a movie like this, when you have a charismatic, maybe bad guy. I don't know what you would describe Tyler Durden as. When you have a charismatic figure, a charismatic anti-hero.
I was going to say, would anti-hero be the right term for him?
If you have somebody who is a charismatic anti-hero or a charismatic figure at the center of a movie, but they are not meant to be a positive role model or meant to be somebody who the audience emulates, you still have that risk of people who are still susceptible to the message that the characters in the movie would be susceptible to, really also falling into that as well and maybe missing the point. So there's always a risk in that. But ultimately, yeah, I do think the movie pretty strongly sides against that kind of thing. So, what did you think about the movie?
I thought that it was a very well-made movie. I thought it was very visually interesting and it had a lot of interesting ideas. I don't know that I would say that I enjoyed it because it is very bleak. And I felt, you said that David Fincher has said that he wants his movies to scar. Am I remembering that correctly? I think he succeeded with this one. It just made me feel sad.
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't necessarily use the term enjoy, but I appreciated it.
Okay. That's interesting. Because I would classify Fight Club ultimately as a black comedy because there are some very funny moments and ultimately it is, I wouldn't say it's necessarily satire, but it's in the same ballpark as satire where it is about, and maybe it is satire, maybe you could call it satire, where it's taking a thing that does exist, that kind of directionless feeling of men, and that the entire movie is this man creates an imaginary figure, starts a cult and a national terrorist group because he couldn't talk to a girl. So I mean, in a way, maybe it was satire of incel culture before incel culture even existed, before anybody even really knew what that word was or what that thing was. So things that are bleakly funny and that did tickle me a little bit didn't necessarily resonate with you. So things like some of the support group humor.
The support group humor I actually probably liked.
Like Chloe.
Oh, Chloe. Chloe dying of cancer.
Yeah.
Wants to get laid one more time.
Yeah.
Has a bunch of supplies in her apartment to aid in her
I have lubricants
sexual
and
conquest.
amyl nitrate.
No, I did appreciate the humor of the support groups, and it was maybe things later on that I didn't, and that's not even necessarily true. I do enjoy dark humor, but I think what I was seeing in this movie, starting at the beginning with the support groups that he is attending, and then later on with Fight Club and then Project Mayhem, is this juxtaposition between hope and hopelessness, and as a way of dealing with difficulties in life. And I feel that even though there were some things that were funny in a black way later on in the movie, it was really leaning into that hopelessness for me. And that just made me feel down.
Okay.
Until the very end, I think, once he moves on from the support groups to Fight Club, until the very end of the movie, there is this overall sense of hopelessness about the world. Even though the men in the movie are trying to do these things to address their own sense of directionlessness and just confusion about their place in the world and things like that. For me, because I didn't think that it was the right way to go about it, I just felt bleak.
That's fair. And again, it is, especially if you're reading into it and maybe through a 2024 lens, it does seem a little bit bleak, because we do know that not only are there large groups of directionless, violent men out there looking for a charismatic leader, looking for someone to help them define what it means to be a man, we also have a lot more backlash over perceived enemies that weren't there before. So you have perceived threats. We have a renewed push towards Nazism. We have a renewed push towards anti-women and anti-trans sentiments and even anti-gay sentiments, which we'll get into the gay subtext of this movie in a little bit, which is something I think a lot of the straight men who watch this movie maybe miss a little bit too. But they have targets now, and that maybe makes it a little bit scarier, because in this movie, their ire is entirely focused at capitalism and consumerism. And I think those are things that most people can say, even if they're not 100% bad, they can be very damaging, and they can be very problematic at best, if not just awful. But I can see how in that context, then, and looking back, you can say, all right, well, that is grim, because these people do exist, and they are much scarier, I think, in the real world than the Project Mayhem space monkeys.
Absolutely. And I do think the movie was scary in those ways. I think that even though I did feel some empathy for the characters, and, we get to know them a little bit, and, I didn't hate any of the men who were part of the Fight Club. But there was a part later on in the movie after Project Mayhem is really going, and you used the word cult earlier, and I did think this is very cult-like, and it was terrifying to think that these men were so devoted to this movement and to this organization and to this person who you have to imagine. And again, I'm watching this with the foreknowledge that Edward Norton and Brad Pitt are one person. I wish I didn't know that, because I would be interested to read this. I was interpreting the things that would be a second watch. You watch the movie for the first time, you don't know that, then you go back, you see all the signs. I was seeing all those signs already.
I was really hoping that maybe the movie red herringed you and maybe you had doubts about that.
Well, there were a couple of times where I was like, well, actually, now I'm confused because I'm not sure. But as it continued to go on, I was like, oh, no, I was right. And I'm seeing these signs.
There's a lot of, in hindsight, there are a lot of very loud foreshadowing moments that are so brilliantly placed, because it really is. It's one of those, it's in front of you the whole time moments. But if you go into the movie without any kind of expectation, it becomes such a slap in the face on the second watching. So things like the way Marla reacts to Jack and to Tyler, the way that some of the lines, like when you first see Brad Pitt on the escalator at the airport, could I be a different person? Is the narration is, would I wake up a different person? So things like that.
So are we to assume, and that's I wanted to ask you about that moment where we see Brad Pitt at the airport, that he is a real person in that moment that Edward Norton sees and then just adopt, or it's...
I never had that thought, but that's entirely possible.
Because later on, when it's revealed that they're the same person, Brad Pitt is saying, I look how you want to look. I act the way that you want to act. And so maybe it was projection on Edward Norton's part to see this guy and think that's what I want, which why would you? Because honestly, Brad Pitt's style in this movie was really upsetting. His outfits, his hair, his little goatee.
The ridiculous Oakley glasses and the fur coat.
I hated it.
The red leather jacket.
No, not a fan. So if that's what you want to emulate, gross. Sorry. If anybody listening wants to emulate that style, I'm sure you'll pull it off wonderfully. But I don't know why Edward Norton was like, yes, if that's what happened. That is how I read it later on.
That's an interesting reading. I never had that thought. I always thought that was just something about the movie introducing us to Tyler. But that could be one way of reading it. Like he's travel sick, he's tired, and he sees this dude and he's like, this dude is like awesome looking. I want to be that dude. And then that's when it comes from.
Well, it's that moment. And then also there is a brief moment where you see Brad Pitt in the background at baggage claim when Edward Norton is talking to the agent about, in the event of a dildo. But you see Brad Pitt like steal a car or something, and someone yells at him, and that's when I got confused because I'm like, this doesn't seem like an imaginary person. So then later, that's when I was like, well, maybe those things really happened, and Edward Norton was aware of it, and then that's what he projected this alter ego onto this person that he had seen behaving in a aspirational way.
Well, I think for a movie with an unreliable narrator, I think you might be putting a little bit too much stock into what you see. It could be one of those things where maybe that happened, maybe Jack did it, maybe Jack saw, or maybe...
So Jack is Edward Norton. Is that another... Because I just saw the narrator
He does not have a name. So the character
his name is Tyler Durden, right?
No, his name is not Tyler Durden, is a made-up name. And different... I think the book makes that more explicit. Okay. And I think at one point, an earlier draft of the screenplay, when he confronts Marla in the cafe, when they have the conversation about it, he shows her his driver's license to prove that his name isn't Tyler Durden.
But he has the plane tickets.
This was the 90s. You didn't need to show ID necessarily. You could just book
okay.
You could just book a plane ticket and whatever name you wanted.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Pre 9/11. Good times.
Fair enough.
So yeah, no, his name, he doesn't have a name. The screenplay refers to him as Jack because of the series of articles about, right. Funnily enough, so I actually just read this. So the original articles were in Reader's Digest. They were called, it was actually Joe. I am Joe's heart. I am Joe's lover, whatever. And they couldn't get the rights to that. But Jim Ulls, the screenwriter, had just started referring, because he didn't want to write narrator every single time. It doesn't read well on a screenplay. So he had just started calling the narrator Jack, just as sort of a generic name. So then it worked out very serendipitously because they needed a new name. So I am Jack's liver.
Yes, we did. Sorry. I wanted to clarify that.
No, I would think, so you could read it a couple of different ways. Maybe that's something that he's looking out the window and he sees a guy who's just like left his car with the keys in, and he's like, because I've had intrusive thoughts like that. Like I could just hop in that car and drive off and no one could stop me. And so maybe he's just having that thought and he's thinking, oh yeah, no, I could totally do that. Or maybe that's something that he did as Tyler Durden, and the movie is an unreliable narrator. You don't know exactly what's happening from moment to moment. And the movie does cheat at several points. There are several things that would be impossible for a person to do by themselves. And in the scene when Tyler reveals himself in the hotel room, you know, the movie gestures at that and shows you things where it's like he, instead of handing the beer to a person, he just drops the beer on the ground. And so the movie explicitly says, what you saw, you can't have trusted.
Well, I did have the thought that the mechanics of this dissociation were a little confusing and totally not realistic.
Right. No,
that's not how it works. But
right.
I understand that's for, you know, plot purposes. So I didn't take a huge issue with it. But I was like, this doesn't make any sense.
Right. No, it is not. It's not an actual portrayal of dissociative identity disorder. It's a man with insomnia and an imaginary friend.
Right.
And it's an allegory. It's not a real. This is not.
But the reason that I kind of even brought this up in the first place, we're talking about the cult-like nature of the Fight Club. And once we have learned that, I guess, Jack and Tyler are the same person and see some of these instances of what it actually looked like when we originally thought that they were interacting, you have to imagine that the men in the club could tell that something was off about this guy because he was behaving strangely. And we know that Marla was noticing that there were things that were strange. And so to me, it was terrifying to interpret the movie as these men having this intense devotion to someone who we at least have reason to assume was behaving in a mentally unwell way.
I think the movie even hints to that. Like the movie even says at one point, because when Bob meets Jack outside of Marla's...
Bob. Poor Bob.
Poor Bob. His name was Robert Paulson.
His name was Robert Paulson.
When Bob meets Jack and they have the discussion about it, and he says something about Tyler Durden only sleeps 2 hours a night. And then there's the other thing when Jack is chasing down Tyler and trying to figure out what happened while he was out of control. Essentially, one of the guys that he interviews in one of the other cities says he was born in a mental institution. So like the legends came because he probably was occasionally talking to himself. Right. He probably was occasionally being very weird, and people were noticing that he also never slept. So
right. But that to me is scary, that they would glom onto this person who that should have been more concerning. But I mean, I do get it, but it was really that's I'm just saying we have a perfectly good real life example. I guess that's true.
And
that's scary. It's
barely string a sentence together.
And it's just as terrifying in real life. That's why I'm just saying that I think scary is an apt way to describe what's happening
now
there.
I kind of wonder, there should be a Fight Club 3 and Tyler Durden gets elected president.
Oh, God. Cult militarization. These are all things that I was thinking watching this movie, and it was very frightening.
I love this movie. It's definitely one of my top 10. I used to say it was my favorite movie. I think it's moved down a little bit, and part of it is just because of some of the real world implications and viewing it now, especially, I think it has aged pretty well. It's scarier now. It feels a lot more real now than it did in 1999 because of everything that's happened in the last 24 years. But it is still such an immaculately crafted movie. It is so good. Some things I'm not sure if you necessarily appreciate now watching it in 2024. Some of the visuals in this movie were so cutting edge at the time. So things like the shot where in the very beginning, Brad Pitt is looking out the window of the skyscraper and then the camera just falls through, falls out the window of the skyscraper into the garage and then through the van into the bombs. That was such a cool visual. And at the time in 1999, I would say this is a relatively mid-budget movie because it did have a big cast and a lot of visual effects and a big name director, but they also knew that this was an R-rated niche movie. And so they weren't expecting it to make, $1 billion or anything like that. So it was a mid-budget movie, but those special effects were really, really cutting edge at the time. Some of them are now starting to show their age a little bit 25 years later, but they have aged really, really well. And a lot of visual effects from 1999 didn't. I want to know what your thought was, because you went into this movie thinking this is a movie about fighting. And then the opening shot is you're coming out of first of all, you have the opening credits set to the really awesome score by the Dust Brothers, with the flashing, almost subliminal message opening credits. And then you come out Edward Norton's head with the gun, and then you've got Brad Pitt there, and then there's bombs, and all of a sudden there's a flashback within a flashback. What was your impression? Because the movie just starts at 100 miles an hour.
It absolutely does. I was immediately like, there's already so much going on. But as far as my thoughts on the sort of opening imagery with the gun and the bombs and everything like that, I sort of already alluded to this, and maybe this is simplistic, but for me, it's not a huge leap to go from fighting to more extreme violence. I think that violence begets violence. So to me, it's not like, oh, I thought this was about a fight club. Why is there now a gun and bombs? To me, that is a logical progression.
Well, and I honestly wonder how much of that is like, would that have necessarily occurred to everyone in 1999? It's hard to remember back now. Would that thought be as natural as it is now?
And maybe not. I don't know.
When you go from, guys in polo shirts with tiki torches marching through Charlottesville to running over protesters, like that's a very sane jump. It's very easy to say, yeah, no, we know that happens.
And maybe that is exactly why I felt that way, because it didn't strike me as odd. What was odder was then going back to before the events of the opening scene and before the fight club, when Edward Norton is going to support groups for testicular cancer and all these other ailments. That was where I was like, what is going on here?
Yeah, no, I love that intro. This was a movie that I came to after it was already out on VHS. Because that's how we watched movies back in the caveman days. It was a recommendation from a film nerd friend. I had the same impression as you that, this is just a movie about punching. There was another movie at the time that I don't think has stood the test of time. I've never seen it, but there was a movie called Boiler Room, and it came out around the same time. And I got the impression that it was like guys in ties punching each other. And I wasn't interested. And I was like, I don't care. I didn't know anything about that. And I was just getting into movies at the time. So I had a friend who was my film nerd friend in high school, and he was like, you really need to watch this movie. So I sat down in my room and I watched the opening credits, and like immediately after the opening credits and everything, I was like, I need to connect my stereo. I actually had to like go through the process of wiring up my stereo so I could get decent sound from this movie, because it was such a cool opening. The opening scene hits so hard, and it's such a cool introduction to the movie. And the music is just fantastic. The music is from the Dust Brothers, who produced some really, really great albums from the 90s, including Beck's Odelay, one of my all-time favorite albums, Paul's Boutique by the Beastie Boys. They produced that as well. And Bop by Hansen.
Oh, now you're speaking my language.
So there's actually
just kidding. I didn't really like Hansen, but
there's a connection between Hansen and Tyler Durden. Was there anything else about the movie before we get into recapping? Was there anything about the movie that surprised you? Anything that, because you knew the twist, and so you were analyzing it from that perspective, it's really a shame that you did know that, because the movie, it hits so hard if you don't know. But it is one of those things that now it's a 25-year-old movie, so it's like The Sixth Sense, or Citizen Kane.
Wait, what's the twist in The Sixth Sense?
Haley Joel Osment grows up to be a less cute man.
Aw.
That's the twist.
He's really good on What We Do in the Shadows.
Yeah, that is true.
He's really good. Well, to answer your question, no, there really wasn't anything else that surprised me, not after we had talked about who was in the movie, because I think the things that would have surprised me would have been the presence of Helena Bonham Carter and Meatloaf, and I guess Jared Leto, who really doesn't have a lot to do in this movie. That, I guess, surprised me. This must have been...
It was 1999. So it was after...
My So-Called Life.
Yeah, it was after My So-Called Life.
But I guess before he really became big, because I think probably not too long after this, he would have been more of a presence.
Or an insufferable person anyway.
Or an insufferable, but yeah. But those would have been the things that surprised me, because I had no idea that any of them were in the movie, but obviously you told me, and I would have seen their names in the opening credits. So as far as plot elements, no, I don't think anything really surprised me.
Do you want to talk about your family history with Meatloaf?
My family likes Meatloaf. I don't know. I was going to say they love them, but I'm not sure that that's actually true. But we did have Meatloaf's Bad Out of Hell album. But the big element of my family history with Meatloaf is that when I was a kid, we used to have family get-togethers, and my uncle had a karaoke machine that we would set up in my basement. And there were some classic songs that would get performed at every party. And one of those songs was Paradise by the Dashboard Light, which is a song about sex. It is a song about a guy trying to have sex with his girlfriend in the back of a car. And then she basically makes him promise to love her forever in order for her to have sex with him. And he says he will, and they have sex. And then he's like, that was a bad move. I'm sick of you now. That's the TLDR of Paradise by the Dashboard Light. We sang the song as a family. I cannot explain why that was allowed to happen. I would like to retroactively call CPS on the adults. I knew every word to that song by the time I was 9 years old. And it wasn't until later on that I actually understood what the song was about. And that is one of the weirdest things about my childhood. And there are a lot of weird things, but that is really up there.
What did you think about Meatloaf's performance in this movie?
I thought he was great.
He is. I think he's really good. He had lost a lot of weight, apparently, before starting this movie. And so they put him in a fat suit.
With large breasts.
Yeah, and in fact, they...
I will not use the term that they use.
Bitch tits?
I do not like that at all.
I guess that was an actual term from, at least from the 90s.
What, medically?
No, from a term that weightlifters who were using steroids, they would develop large mammary glands as a result of that. And so the bitch tits, I think, was a term that they used.
That's gross. That is very offensive to me.
They also did several tests of prosthetics that he could wear with his shirt off, and they didn't like the look of him. So that's why in the one scene you see Bob fighting in Fight Club, he breaks the rules of Fight Club. He has his shirt on because it just doesn't look right without it.
Well, that makes sense.
There's also a shot, and I wasn't sure if you clocked this or not, but after they terrorize the police commissioner and they all bust out of the hotel, it's a really good shot. And so they used that shot, but Meatloaf's pants fell down. So Meatloaf is in the background, and you can see, first of all, you can see the padding from the fat suit, and it's just out, and he's just struggling and pulling up his pants real fast, but nobody noticed until the final print.
I didn't see that, no. Nope, missed it. Sorry.
So no, I think Meatloaf's performance is really good. He does a very good job selling, I think, the one of the two characters that you as an audience care about, which is you at first you don't, and again, you were coming at it from a different perspective. If you're watching it the first time, Marla seems chaotic and awful and like a terrible person, and then you're watching it the second time and you're like, oh, it's tragic. It is unfortunate. She is in essentially an abusive relationship with somebody who doesn't know he's abusing her. He's gaslighting himself too.
Yeah, I did really feel for her. So I think you're right that knowing the twist made me have a different perspective on her character. And her performance was really good too, because I did feel her confusion and heartbreak at the way that she was being treated. I thought she did a great job.
I always thought her accent was questionable.
There are some moments where it's great, and then there are some moments where the British really is coming through.
Well, apparently a lot of people didn't know she was British, and so when she showed up in the Harry Potter movies, they were like, wait, what? And imagine that. My mom loved this British movie called A Room with a View that Helena Bonham Carter is in, so I always knew who she was before Fight Club, and a lot of other people, this was their introduction to Helena Bonham Carter. And then she starts showing up in Tim Burton movies and Harry Potter, and everybody knows her from Fight Club. And I was like, nah, she's Charlotte from A Room with a View.
Aw, that's lovely. It was interesting to me that she is really the only woman in this movie.
There's a few others, but we have Chloe, we have some of the people no, this movie does not pass the Bechdel test at all.
No, not at all.
But I think, again, that's kind of the point, right?
Yeah, no, there really wasn't room for another woman because that isn't what the movie is about. But I did obviously note that, and I do think it's interesting going back to what I was saying before about the sort of Fight Club acolytes being so devoted, even though Edward Norton's character must have been showing some signs of mental illness. Really, it's through Marla that we are getting the idea that something is not right. Like, she is the one who is reacting the most appropriately to this disjointed, confusing behavior.
Yeah, she is. And again, that's something that you don't get on first viewing, I think. First viewing, you just think she's weird. Like, she's being weird to her kind of boyfriend's roommate.
Right.
And inappropriate. And then on second viewing, you're like, oh, no, she's just trying to make a connection with this guy.
Yeah.
And he is being shitty to her.
Yeah, I really felt for her.
What about our two leads, Brad Pitt, Edward Norton?
In terms of what did I think of their performances? I thought they were really good. I thought everybody did a good job in this movie, honestly.
Yeah, they both got in such crazy shape for this movie. I love some of Brad Pitt's deliveries in this movie. Brad Pitt, this was right on the cusp of when people were learning that Brad Pitt could be funny. He had that reputation for if you want a good-looking, smoldering guy in your movies, cast Brad Pitt. And between Fight Club, Snatch, and a few other movies that came out around this time, then it was like, oh yeah, no, he can be like a full-on like movie star. He can do a lot of fun things and a lot of different things.
I clocked that 7 Years in Tibet was on the marquee at the movie theater.
Clearly, we had a lot of thoughts on this movie, so we're going to break this one up into two parts. If you'd like to hear our full recap of the movie Fight Club and more of our conversation on gender, violence, terrorism, and subliminal penises, check out part 2 of this episode next time on Blind Spots and Second Thoughts. Thanks for listening.